All right, so now we're going to look a little bit at the supposedly Wild West. The title of this, Taming the Wild West, Expansion, Exploitation, and Exasperation. So really what I want to look at sort of a broad 30,000 foot view is looking at ways in which the West was settled, sort of the ideas and the mentalities of the people that were there, addressing a lot of the mythologies about the West, and then digging into really the untold story of the West, which was the results of the Indian Wars from the 1870s to the 1890s. And tapping into the notion that the West was not this open, empty, vast place just waiting to be settled, that it was incrementally settled. It was already populated. And the ways in which it was settled was done so with more violence than any of the Wild West mythology that we see promulgated in books and movies. So that's really what I want to get at going over this section. All right, so when we're talking about the West, one of the things that we need to understand is the mentality of those who looked at the West and settled the West from the standpoint of the time that Western expansion was going on. So, in order to get to the 1870s and 90s, we got to dig back a little bit. We have to discuss a concept that is all too often sort of bookended only between the 1830s and 40s. Like basically, the concept of manifest destiny comes to exist in people's minds only in the 1830s as Americans expand into areas like Texas, and it comes to an end supposedly at the end of the Mexican-American War. But we're going to see that this idea of manifest destiny as a concept was alive and well before the 1830s. And it's something that's unfortunately still alive and well today. Okay? So, first, I want to start by just a reminder, and I know many of you already probably have a good idea of this, but the United States was itself born out of empire. We emerged as an independent nation from the 13 British colonies, really only 12, but okay, 13 British colonies that we claimed oppressed us, used us, violated ideas, core ideas central to our belief set, and so therefore we fashioned our own nation. Now, the thought was after that since we were born of empire, the one thing that the United States wanted to avoid was becoming the same thing that the British had been to us, right? A nation that just expands and exploits, right, for its own benefit. But one of the things we're going to find is that even before we were a nation, Americans were already doing those things, exhibiting those behaviors, and it's something that will continued after. Now, let's start with this concept, manifest destiny. Now, the guy who comes up with the phrase, right, the idea that the motivations, they were there well before he came up with this phrase, but the guy who coined this phrase, manifest destiny, was a news reporter in 1846 named John O'Sullivan. And he was writing for a Democratic newspaper, and he wrote an article about America's manifest destiny out west. Now, let's just sort of give a broad definition of manifest destiny, right? So before we get to the actual two-part definition, I first want to take a look at the words themselves. Right? Something that is manifest is something that is obvious to everyone. So the dictionary defines manifest as clear or obvious to the eye or mind. Right? Destiny is sort of a preordained outcome, right? And this is what dictionary.com, something that is to happen or has happened to a particular person or thing. The predetermined, usually inevitable, irresistible course of events. Okay? So if you take something that is manifest, that is obvious to everyone with their eye and with their mind, and combine that with destiny, a predetermined, inevitable, irresistible outcome, you get the sense at which he sort of put this phrase together. It gives you a basic concept. But to dig into really what that phrase means, we got to give a more specific definition. And so I give this in two parts, right? It's a two-part definition. The first part of manifest destiny is a belief in the superiority of American ideas and institutions. That is a belief in the superiority of American ideas and institutions. Right? The second part, that it's the duty of all Americans to spread those beliefs and ideas and institutions to others, whether they want them or not. That it's the duty of all Americans to spread those ideas, beliefs, and all that to others, whether they want them or not. Now, let's talk about those superior ideals or institutions. So this is typically where people, especially Americans born here, when they start in their mind sort of pontificating of, when people say that America is the best in the world, right? What ideas or institutions are we talking about when we talk about qualifying as best? So let's talk about some of these. So typically, right, if we talk about political ideas and institutions, most of the time, and there's many answers for this, things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, representative government, right, free elections, these types of things that Americans define as far as our political system, superior set of ideals and institutions. Now, the reality is that most Americans have never lived under any other political system. So I always equate this to, and we just had Father's Day not too long ago, but I equate this to, like, on Father's Day, I get my father a card, and I mean it when I tell him, man, you are the best dad in the world. Well, compared to what? What in my comparison? He's the only dad I've ever had. So how would I know? Right? But this is what a lot of folks would say, right? That these are the superior political ideas that America has, and that it's our duty to spread those to others. Notice, it doesn't matter whether or not they ask for it, they need it. They need it. Because if it worked for us, this line of reasoning goes, it's got to work for them. B, economic ideas and institutions, so things like capitalism, free markets. Back then they would say laissez-faire, or as they say here in Texas, lazy-fairy. laissez-faire economic system, a government hands-off economic system. Uh, Religious ideas and institutions. So, what superior beliefs, ideas, institutions? So, back during this period, right, it's going to be a lot of stressing of not just Christianity, but Protestant Christianity, because you have to remember that during this period of time, there was a lot of anti Catholicism, also a lot of anti Semitism. Uh, and some people might say, well, the freedom to worship as you see fit. And I would say yes and no, right? That, yeah, the government's not going to necessarily stop you from those types of things. But there are going to be consequences, social, economic, and political. So if we just go with back to Catholics for a moment, you could legally be Catholic in the United States during this period. But in a lot of places, if you were Catholic, you wouldn't get elected just for the fact that you're Catholic, right? And you would be considered different, maybe in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s, if you were Catholic. Now, fast forward to just a little bit to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even in the 70s and 80s, and think about the Mormons, right? Sure, you could be a Mormon, but one of the things that you've sort of learned about or should learn about in the first half of U.S. history is that, yeah, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, ended up getting murdered along with his brother because of his beliefs, right? So there are going to be freedom of religion, but with a lot of baggage along with that, depending on what religion that is. And then you have D here, racial or ethnic ideas of superiority. So here we're going to see, right, white superiority, sort of native Northern and Western European white superiority during this period of time. And the thing is, right, these are going to be presented as gifts, right, that people need. So notice how we're redefining empire building, or at least trying to. We're trying to muddy the water. We're trying to say that unlike the British that exploited the colonies, we're not going to do that, right? But we're going to bring you all these great and wonderful things that we think are so awesome that you never asked for. And maybe you don't want, but we know you need them. So what you get is this becomes a cover for the real realities of what empire building has always been about, right? Empire building has always been about gaining control and access and control to resources and people, right? That's why European states settled North America in the Americas in the first place. And so it's not out of the realm of belief to understand that as Americans, we don't like that narrative of thinking of ourselves as engaging in practices that not only are contrary to our sort of founding mythology, but also, right, going against ideas that may be contrary to our beliefs about what's right. So what politicians and businesses largely are going to do, and newspapers are going to do this as well, often when they talk about expansion, they're going to end up dressing it in these concepts of manifest destiny. That, hey, don't feel guilty, it's supposed to be yours, right? It was given to you by God, and think of all the good that you're spreading. When in reality, it's going to end in the deaths of tens of thousands of Native Americans, their forceful removal from a place that for centuries they called home, not in a place that is wild and open and ready to be settled, but in a place that had already been settled by people that had their own belief systems, had their own governments, had their own way of life that did not dovetail with ours. So, Manifest Destiny is a way of putting a candy coating on the hard pill of empire building that gets swallowed. And so we're going to see that really this is key to understanding westward expansion. And later on in the next section, when we talk about expansion beyond our 48 contiguous borders, uh, it's going to be key to understanding that as well. So, despite the fact that we try to sell ourselves on some of these ideas as positive, and obviously everyone should at least know that there's nothing positive about white superiority. There's nothing positive about trying to essentially force your religion on other groups of people. There's not necessarily anything positive about trying to force an economic system on people that don't want it, right? Or nothing positive about forcing political ideas on people that don't want them. And this is going to be something that we wrestle with even today, because notice how this goes beyond Native Americans. This is why Manifest Destiny goes even beyond American expansion into areas like the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Right? What do we tell those folks? Well, what do you need? You need democracy. Oh yeah, open up your country to capitalism. Right? That's why we're doing this. We're doing it for them. When the reality is, when you boil it down, largely we're doing it for ourselves. Empires, whether it's ours, the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, the Italians, whoever you want to look to in world history, empire building is very seldom, if at all, about the people that are having things done to them, and it's always about the people that are doing things to those folks, right? So just something to keep in mind. All right, so in this section, we're going to look at ways in which the U.S. federal government went out of its way really to incentivize Western expansion. So one of the things that I present this to counteract is the belief, the sort of mythos that the people went out west sort of took little bits of nothing and turned it into something. But the reality is that the federal government aided in Western expansion in ways they never did back east. As we're going to see here, giving away of free or cheap land, the establishment of educational institutions, these types of things are ways that the government attempted to propel westward expansion. Because one of the beliefs is sort of that through just hard work and dedication, the West was settled by hardscrabble people. But what is often missed is the role that the federal government played in making that happen. And also the way in which the federal government does this uh, to help out certain segments of the population, but also denies various schemes to turn, for instance, formerly enslaved African Americans into landholders. So a lot of these things are only going to be open to white settlers. So we're going to touch on these rather quickly. So the Morrill Land Grant, this passed in the midst of the Civil War, 1862. And the purpose of it, right, is to promote education out west and create institutions to deal with all of the changes in technology. So here's how it works, right? So every state received, because most states have some federal government lands within their boundaries. So every state that had federal government lands would be given 30,000 acres of federal government land per congressman that they had, right? So in populous states, that's a lot of land that's going to be given. And what those lands are scheduled to be used for are what are called land grant colleges, right? So this is going to be for public universities that are going to pop up in these areas uh, and act in many ways not only as a magnet to bring people to the area, but also as a way to educate and modernize people on new technology, new concepts, new science. The easiest way to tell what are land grant institutions is to look for two letters. And those letters are A, the other one is M, right? So if you know of any colleges with A&M standing for agriculture and mechanics, that is what we are discussing. So this is going to help in a rather major way to bring a lot of modernity out to the West. By far, and probably most importantly, is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, again, in the midst of the Civil War, the overall point of it, and this is what I want you to take away from it, was to try to encourage individuals and families to move west. And basically what it said was that if you could pay $10 and promise to stay on that land for a period of 5 years and show just basic minor improvements to that land, then you would get 160 acres, right? And most people would only be expected to show some use or improvement to 40 acres of that land. Now, a couple of things here. One, we're going to see that this is a almost free giveaway in terms of land to settlers. However, the bulk of the land that is going to be claimed by this are going to be claimed instead of by the people that it was supposed to by and large. is going to be claimed by corporations, particularly railroad and mining corporations out west, and they engaged in a lot of fraud to get it done because basically they would give their employees the money. They would go down and they would register for the land. The company would make some improvements on it, and then 5 years later it would be theirs for a dirt cheap price, right? So companies misrepresented who the landholders were, and as a result, what we get out of that is companies getting the bulk of the windfall in terms of land amounts claimed. Now, the rest of these, all the way down to timber and stone acts, are additions onto it, right? Additions onto it, and they're even more than what I left here, uh, than what I wrote here. But you get the idea that they're willing to give additional land in areas that they're really wanting to drive settlement. Now, the other part is that by the time we get to 1902, instead of requiring people to make improvements on a lot of this land, the federal government is going to start making improvements to the land to make it more desirable. So in 1902, we get the Newlands Reclamation Act, in which the federal government takes money, tax money that they got from the sale of western lands in about 16 western states, and they are going to publicly finance irrigation projects. Because if you think about it, right, the bulk of the people that are moving out to this area are going to be farmers. And one of the things as you start moving west that you start running low on until you get all the way basically to California, Oregon, Washington, to that west coast, is water. So these are all ways in which the federal government try to incentivize folks to move and settle the West. And part of it was to make sure that you had, a nation that expanded from east to west. But also, this was done as a way to try to put pressure on Native Americans to give up claims to a lot of these areas. And as we're going to see, that along with literal wars are going to do just that. All right, so here we want to talk about one of the frontiers out in the West, and that's going to be the mining frontier. So, of course, back in the 1840s, a little bit before the breadth of this class, we're going to see that the discovery of gold in 1848 by a guy named James Marshall, who you see there, this accidental discovery of gold along the American River there in the Sierra Nevada gold fields, is going to end up setting up the great California gold rush in the year that followed. There were also areas of gold that were discovered. One of these areas is going to be known, and this is pretty quick as well. This is in 1848, known as the Mormon Diggings. This is going to be in the southern part of the Sierra Nevada gold fields. And the reason it's called the Mormon Diggings is because a lot of the investors, given the location of the gold find, are going to be Mormons, though not all of them. Now you have to remember, Mormon territories, LDS territories or LDS followers, settled not just what we consider Utah, but areas going as far west as Las Vegas, right, and even parts of Southern California. So, given when gold is discovered, as word starts to spread, they're very close. A lot of them are going to band together, even have some outside investors. And this is going to be one of the few areas that really strikes a big amount of gold. One of the guys that's going to make some initial money off of this is a guy who's not a Mormon at all, but he's a businessman named Loeb Strauss. Now, Loeb Strauss is a German immigrant who gets into this investment money, but realizes that really there are only sort of a couple of ways of making true money out here aside from just hitting a big vein. One way is if you're a mining company. If you're a mining corporation, not only do you have better tools, you have more investors, you've got more capital so you can buy up more land, right? You've got all those things going for you. So because you can buy up more than an individual person, the likelihood of you striking it's going to be bigger. Now, relating to Strauss, he's going to end up making a bigger fortune in what's called being an outfitter. So outfitters is the other big group that are going to make a lot of money in the California gold rush. And they are the ones that are going to provide gold seekers with the supplies that they need. Now, Strauss is going to sell a number of things, but what is going to become the big money maker for him is something that he himself didn't create. A buddy of his is going to come up with an idea. Right? Now, this friend of his was named Jacob Davis, who had been one of Levi Strauss's friends and customers. And Davis becomes an inventor. And so what happens is that Jacob Davis didn't know the ins and outs of getting his invention patented. He didn't have the money to get it patented. So what's going to happen is he comes up with the concept of putting copper rivets on denim pants. So if you got blue jeans on or you wear them, look around your pockets. You're going to see some copper rivets that are put in the corner there. And part of the reason is to make sure that they're strong, that your pockets just don't rip when you put your hand in them. So one of the things that we sort of know is that Loeb Strauss, who his friends called Levi Strauss, he didn't invent denim jeans. They'd been around for a long while. But he is going to help his buddy Jacob Davis patent this new style of work pants. And they're actually fairly expensive, but they're high quality. And one of the things that makes them so popular and sort of propels them to becoming the empire of Levi Strauss and Company that it eventually does is that they have a warranty on them. And basically, if you show, like, if you look at Levi's today, they have a back tag above the hip pocket that has, you know, the name of the company and all that. Now, back in the day, the thread that they used to attach that stuff was orange. So if your pants ripped or shredded or tore in any way, all you had to do was bring in that old beat-up pair of pants, and they would look for that orange thread to make sure that these were pants that they made, and they would replace them no matter what, right? Now, the bulk of people that make their way to the California Gold Rush in the years, especially the 3 years following 1849, are going to bust. So, this idea that everybody went out there to get rich didn't happen. But it is going to put California in a position to become heavily populated with a diverse population, because you have to remember this was not just an American gold rush. This got people from all over the globe, from areas of Europe and Asia and Latin America and so on, that are going to make their way to try to strike it rich. But again, the vast majority of people bust. 10 years later, we're going to see another gold rush, this time in Colorado. The guys that are responsible for beginning this gold rush are guys that had attempted to get rich in California. John Beck and William Green Russell had made their way from North Carolina. John Beck was a Native American. He was part of the Cherokee tribe. And as they were making their way across the front range of the Colorado Rockies, they run into some other natives and they hear stories about gold. Now, they're focused on California, so they continue onward, but they sort of put in the back of their mind where this is. Now, when they get to California, they bust and they head back to North Carolina and, right, make some more money and then plot how they're going to get back to Colorado. Now, at this point, Colorado was a territory, was just a wide open sort of spot. And in fact, the area that they're going to discover gold in was land that was ceded to Native Americans as their reservation land by the federal government. So they make their way into this area, and we're going to see that they start noticing sort of open vein. And what I mean by that is sort of cracks in the ground where you can just dig around a little bit. You don't have to dig a mine or anything, and you can see gold veins, little bits of gold in the rock. Now, they find a sizable amount of gold, and they do this in 1858. By 1859, we're going to see that the Colorado Gold Rush is in full effect. Now, the California Gold Rush had brought tens of hundreds of thousands of people westward. But 10 years on, even after the discovery of gold here, we're going to see that a lot more people are hesitant, because by this time, you're finally starting to hear the stories of what was the reality for most people, which was the stories of people busting, right? It's almost like the old analogy. If people knew how many folks lost playing the lottery, nobody would really play. But all they hear about is winners. So it gives them a sense that they could be one too. It maybe is quite easy. So word and more of the reality had spread about the reality of busting. And also by 1859, the economy was not in a great state. We're starting to see us on the sort of edge of the Civil War that's going to break out in 1861. So there was a lot of things going on. So only a few trickle of a few thousands of people are going to make their way. But almost overnight, we're going to see places like Golden, Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, Denver, Colorado, areas that had been just land one day become cities almost overnight. Written on the wagons of a lot of people that go, the phrase Pikes Peak or bust. And again, most of them are going to do the busting. Inherently problematic, as I mentioned just again, is the fact that where these people are settling are on land that was set aside for Native Americans as their reservation land. The federal government has said we will keep white folks out of it. And now with this gold rush, they are unable or unwilling to do so. Another part of westward expansion is going to be the cattle boom, right? And of course, the American cowboy. Now, one of the reasons that the cattle industry really is going to take off during this post Civil War period, it's not that there weren't cattle before. Obviously, there were, right? But because of the shortages caused by the Civil War, and because of the use of a lot of cattle, Eastern cattle, in sort of fighting the war itself, one of the things that you find is that in areas of the North and South, that there are shortages of food. And it just so happens that in South Texas and in areas along the border and even into Mexico, that there are literally millions of cattle that seem to be obliviously roaming about, owned by no one. Now, the reality was that often these cattle were not wild, but this is before the days of branding. This is before the days of barbed wire fences. So even if they were owned, if you cared to know, it would be hard to visibly see from afar. Now, there is a lot of mythology about the cattle industry and the cowboy. So let's take first the fact of the breed of cattle, right? The cattle that are going to be found along these areas are going to be named Texas Longhorns for somewhat obvious reasons. But the reality are that these cattle are not originally from Texas. They were brought over by the Spanish conquistadors, Spanish explorers. Some of them got loose and they started reproducing wildly on the plains. They got the long horns as a means of protection from predators, right? And some of these horns can grow several feet from one side of the cow's head to the other. And if you notice in the picture of the longhorn that I got there, that's not bevo, right? For example, I live way out in the sticks, out west of Decatur. And I've got a lot of neighbors around me that have longhorn cattle. And if I were to show up with this cow here, they would look at me like I was one of the biggest animal cruelty people you'd ever met. Because this guy looks like he's on the verge of starvation. Yet back during the period, this was what cows look like. Bevo, if you Google Bevo, he's way bigger than this, but that's because he's domesticated. He gets fed every day. He's treated better than some people, right? So these cows are going to populate the plains, and these aren't beef cattle like, for example, today. They're not the prime cuts of meat that you want if you're going to get a steak. They don't come from longhorns. But there's millions of them. And so what we're going to see is that these cattle are going to be round up, some legally, some very much illegally, and they're going to be driven to, at least in the early days, where the limits of the railroads ran. So you start to, as you see in the map, right, those green lines are cattle drives that are going to take those cattle to cow towns up in Kansas and in Nebraska where the railroads are so that those cattle can be shipped largely to the East Coast, but also to the West, right? Now, beyond the Texas Longhorns not being from Texas, We're going to see the development of the cowboy. And when most people see this, they think of the cowboy as sort of this iconic American homegrown, you know, creation. But the reality is that there are some issues with calling the cowboy an American creation. One of which is that the cowboy as we know it is adapted, it's not created in whole cloth, but it's adapted from the vaquero and the caballero traditions of the Spanish, uh, especially in South America and in Latin America in general. So there's that. Uh, a lot of the accoutrement, right? The hat, the cowboy hat, iconic cowboy hat, from the Spanish sombrero, right? Uh, you have the ropes, la riata, right? The chaps that they wear to protect their legs and the thick brush, the chapareras. All of these things, right, come out of the Spanish tradition. So what happens is that this gets co-opted by a lot of Anglos because these are the tools of the trade. So it's not that Americans created these ideas, right? They used already pre-existing ideas. Another aspect about the American cowboy mythology is that the vast majority of cowboys were white. This is not accurate. In fact, over half of cowboys were people of color, a large amount African American, and a large amount of them Hispanic. Right? But if you watch movies, typically you see stereotypes portrayed in those movies that if African Americans were anywhere near cattle drives, they're only portrayed as cooks for the cattle drives. And typically Hispanics in Western movies are portrayed as bandits, as the bad guys, rather than good majority of them being a hardworking cowhand. Now, it is true that in a lot of American ranches, that a lot of these ranches are going to be owned by white folks. But the idea that cowboys generally were all white, this is something that is not accurate. And even today, right, there's sort of this somewhat of a stereotype of cowboys being white. But I mean, even here in Fort Worth, Texas, they have the Cowboys of Color rodeo every year in downtown Fort Worth. So there are all kinds of ways to break these stereotypes if one just takes the time to look them up. Then the last thing that we'll talk about is the term itself, cowboy. Most linguists, although there is some debate on this, most linguists believe that none of the people that worked with cattle, that worked for ranches, would have called themselves cowboys. Because to be called a boy, regardless of who you were, was seen as a derogatory thing, not a nice thing to say about somebody. And most likely these people were called cowhands because that's what they did. They handled cattle. That was their job. It's only later that the term cowboy is going to take hold. And most of the time, again, it's more of a derisive comment. Now, the other thing we're going to talk about here is the Wild West, because the cattle are going to be driven to a lot of these towns, one of which that you see there on the map, Dodge City, Kansas. Right? There's a handful of towns that are supposed to be sort of the wildest in the West. Dodge City, Kansas, Tombstone, Arizona, right? Deadwood, Wyoming, or excuse me, Deadwood, South Dakota. So the reality is that a lot of this mythology is perpetuated in stories that are not accurate, right? To give you an example, just a quick example, Dodge City, Kansas, in the first 5 years of its founding, number of murders that they have, and by the way, the deadliest years in Dodge City's history, in terms of murders, for a long while, is during that first 5 years, right? The highest number of murders that you have in those 5 years, if I remember correctly, is 3. A lot of years you have one person who gets murdered, and some years you got 0. But if you think about, like, iconically, the Boot Hill Cemetery, the cemetery that's supposedly devoted to cowboys that died with their boots on, that were killed in shootouts. How did that get filled up if there were only, right, 1 or 2 or 3 people dying every year? Well, out in the West, you have writers that are trying to sell stories. Trying to sell stories back east, because the way that they get paid is they get paid for every paper that reprints their story. And one of the things that people back east want to hear about is they want to hear about the West. Because for many people back east that work just mind-numbing jobs, horrendously deadly jobs for little pay, there's part of them that the West appeals to them. Because in their mind, the way they romanticize it is out in the West, sort of free to go and do as you please, right? You're in charge of your destiny and all this. So they're interested in it. And so often what you get is you get reports that are sensationalized, that get reprinted, and people back east, because they don't know any better, they end up believing them. Or you have dime novels that are written during the period about the exploits of, supposed exploits of the cowboys, the gunfighters, people who had been killed, how many they had killed, and so on. And the reality is that they exaggerated for effect. Because, I mean, if you think about it, just even for a short period of time, if the West, if these Western towns are as violent as they say, where people are literally dying daily, there's no law and order, right? It's essentially a war zone. Why the hell would A, anybody stay there? B, if there's always this violence, people getting thrown through plate glass windows, bars being destroyed, all this other stuff, how is any business person making money, and why wouldn't they leave? I mean, literally, if you were to be asked, like, would you take an all expense paid trip to the middle of a catastrophic war zone? Most rational people would go, no, I'll pass. But it's the idea that it's violent. So often when reporters would go out after hearing reading a lot of their friends' work about the West, many of them would be disappointed for what they saw, but not necessarily disappointed enough not to exaggerate things themselves. Because that's what people wanted to read about. It was exciting. And when people read about that, it also made them want to travel there. And one of the things that these places loved was tourists. Tourists that spend money. So they're willing, right? Townsfolk are willing to have this reputation as a wild and raucous town when they know that it's not in reality as bad as what they say. Because at the end of the day, it's better for their town's image in terms of tourism.
So down there on the bottom left, I've got two guys that are well known. On the left is Doc Holliday. On the right is Matt Masterson. Neither man from the West. They end up out there. These guys do not have long law enforcement careers, right? And most of them engage in behaviors that are sometimes on the other side of the law. And even while they're, like, for example, if you're a town sheriff, you spend a lot more time fixing the main road, filling potholes, fixing the sidewalk than you do worrying about crime coming into your community. Part of the reason that Tombstone, Arizona is going to survive during the time that it does, if you look at the sign there, welcome to Tombstone, Arizona, no carrying of firearms within city limits. So one of the things that makes these places, calms them down out west, is you start to see, right, gun control measures put in place. That when you come into the town, you've got to surrender your firearms at the sheriff's office or some other location, and you can pick them up on your way out. Because what turns these supposedly lawless towns into civilized towns ultimately is going to be regulation, right, and gun control. So again, part of the idea here is that when we talk about the Wild West, we fall in love with the myth of the Wild West. And unfortunately, a lot of people like the myth when the real Wild West, with its complexity, the real West, I should say, with all its complexities, is a lot more interesting to understand, a lot more multi-dimensional, rather than this one-dimensional mythology. But unfortunately, a lot of people want to stick to the myth. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is Native American policy in the post-Civil War period. And we're trying to understand this to understand what happens to Native Americans and sort of the confusion that federal government policy was to begin with toward them. So what I want to start with here is looking at a couple of treaties. We're not going to dig deep into them. I'm going to speak generally about them. But for our purposes, I want to cover two geographical areas. One is going to be the Northern Plains. So when we talk about the Northern Plains, we're talking about Native Americans like the Northern Arapaho, Northern Cheyenne, the Sioux, right, and a few others. The other geographical area that we're going to talk about is the Southern Plains. So we're talking about the Kiowa, the Apache, the Comanche, or actually the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Southern Cheyenne, Southern Arapaho, Native Americans. Now, we have to sort of have an understanding of the way that treaties are put in place, right? Our treaties are agreements by our federal government with another sovereign nation or group, right? And when we make these agreements, regardless of whether or not individually you or I sign these treaties, as Americans, our government created these treaties and we are bound legally to uphold them. And in fact, if we violate a treaty with another country as an American, we can be held responsible for that legally, even though you may not be aware of it or you weren't there to make the decision to join it. So the United States has a centralized government system to where our Senate, the group that ratifies treaties, they speak for us in those treaties. They speak for all Americans. Whereas for Native Americans, we're going to see that their concept of government is very decentralized, right? They may have a chief or a leader or maybe a couple of leaders that call themselves chief, but those leaders don't speak for everyone in the tribe. Tribes are broken down into bands. So let's say you've got the Comanche. There's also a subset, a band that is beneath that, and often these bands are familial bands, right? Families. So, according to Native Americans and the way in which their government is set up, just because a specific native, whether they be a chieftain, whether they be a regular person, if they sign an agreement, that agreement only applies to those who signed. It does not apply to everybody else. So even if a guy who calls himself chief agrees to something with the federal government, he does not speak for all the tribe, and those bands can decide whether or not they want to follow it. So obviously, this is a little bit of a problem, right? Because we've got two different working definitions of how agreements between peoples are reached and what it means. Because when we see a chief agree to a treaty, and we see, right, folks sign to a treaty, our assumption is, oh, that whole nation, that whole group of Native Americans are represented in that decision. Another issue that's sort of a problem is the issue of land ownership. We have to remember that land ownership is a Western European idea that didn't exist everywhere. And so the idea of property is something that to a lot of groups, including Native Americans, doesn't necessarily exist. As part of their religious beliefs, you have gods that created the world, created them, and so their understanding is they can't own something that they didn't make. Now, they might have ancestral hunting lands, lands that for decades or centuries natives had hunted in those areas. But in terms of ownership, this is mine. They held things communally as a tribe, so there is no mine. And even amongst that tribe, it's not theirs because they didn't create it. So this is going to be yet another big issue, right? Now, the other big problem within these treaties is that there are a lot of guarantees made by our federal government that for Native Americans that give up these lands and agree to the treaties, that They will stay within the confines of those reservations, that the federal government will provide them with food in the form of meat, typically cattle, that they will be provided with education, specifically things like agricultural education, because the idea was for a lot of government leaders, they wanted to turn these nomadic hunters into farmers. So, hey, you guys stay in the reservation, don't follow the buffalo anymore. We'll feed you, and on top of that, we'll show you how to farm. Okay. And then in these treaties, agreements are made to keep out other whites, that the federal government will guarantee that whites will not settle on Native American reservation lands. Now, with these last two of, sort of providing food and education, we're going to see that that often doesn't happen. And the same with keeping whites off of Native American lands. So these two treaties, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, there are two of them. We'll talk about why here in a second. And the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek. Both of these are going to be sort of willfully violated by the U.S. government, whether it be failing to keep whites out of the area, failing to make payments that Native Americans were guaranteed, failing to provide edible food, because often the food that would arrive to these places would be spoiled by the time it got there. So at that point, what are you supposed to do if you're a Native American and the U.S. government is not living up to its side of the bargain? Well, obviously, if you can't make a living there, you're going to go back to what you know, which is you're going to start roaming the plains again. And we're going to see that as Native Americans decide to leave the reservation, there's going to be a big backlash to try to prevent them and stop them from doing that. The other thing that's going to be problematic in terms of this relationship between the U.S. and Native American nations partly lies in this Supreme Court case, Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock. Okay, Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock. Now, Lone Wolf was a Kiowa chief. And what Lone Wolf is going to claim is that provision of the treaty required that 3/4 of the adult males in each of the Kiowa, Apache, and Comanche tribes agree to subsequent changes in the terms of the treaty. Now, that treaty, as you see, was made in 1867. Well, in 1892, Congress attempted to alter the reservation lands granted to the tribe. And so they changed the terms of the treaty and opened over 2 million acres of reservation lands to be settled by non-Native Americans. Now, case is going to be taken before the Supreme Court, and the question asked before the Supreme Court is, can treaties between the American Native tribes be broken unilaterally by Congress? And we're going to see in a unanimous decision that they are going to say that Congress can change the terms of the treaty unilaterally at any point that they choose. That Indian lands were the sole jurisdiction of Congress according to the Constitution So therefore, they had the power to, quote, abrogate, which means change, the provisions of the Indian Treaty. Now, notice how that's going to be an issue, right? Because if Congress can change the terms of the agreement at any point they want to, without the approval of Native Americans, what good does it make to make agreements with Congress? All they have to do is change their mind. So this is an extraordinary amount of power that's given to the U.S. Congress. Now, let's talk a little bit here about Native American policies. Often, because it changes a lot and it's varied, you get different administrations that do different things and so on, it's hard to nail down policies. But you can more nail down mindsets, ideologies. So we're going to talk about some of these ideologies that the U.S. government has toward natives. The first you won't see during the period that we're talking about because its ability to maintain ended at the end of the Civil War. And this idea goes all the way back to the Revolutionary period. It's called One Big Reservation. This is going to be an idea that goes all the way from George Washington to Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. The idea behind One Big Reservation is that you create a permanent barrier to settlement between both sides, right? So you put natives on one side, whites on the other, and you create a barrier. Now, early on, the thought was by presidents and secretaries of state that that barrier was going to be the Mississippi River. But Americans would not want lands beyond that. But obviously, as we know, that's not going to be the case. So by the time we get through the Civil War, there's really no ability to continue this sort of government position. So that one's sort of gone, and we got three left. The next is extermination, which is exactly like it sounds. Now, a lot of people associate extermination with policy we know as genocide. And obviously that's a pretty large charge to hurl at the government. And there are some reasons why this is a good charge to hurl at the government because of their actions, but also why this charge would not stick, let's say, in court. One is, right, the definition of extermination, the definition of genocide. Now, a lot of people assume that it can only be genocide if members of one group of people are all killed. But the way that most scholars look at genocide, they look to the UN definition, which basically is an attempt. It doesn't have to be a successful one. Any attempt to kill off groups or parts or the whole of a people, that would be genocide. So just like in World War II, thankfully Adolf Hitler was not successful in his attempt to kill all the Jews in the area. Many are going to survive. So this exterminationist idea is as old as the country is, and it's going to continue sort of long after it's officially gone. The other problem with extermination in terms of getting agreement is that you're not going to find necessarily a smoking gun document where the federal government and Congress says this is our policy, we want to kill Native Americans. But what you will find is a number of individual correspondence in sort of quotes and writings in which people back then are going to argue rather forcefully and rather quickly that is their hope that no Native Americans or no Native Americans end up there for any period of time. Next, Native American ideology is going to be assimilation. And assimilation is the idea that Native Americans are going to basically give up everything that makes them native in favor of adopting white cultural ways. So that means giving up Native American dress and Native American hairstyles and Native American names and Native American languages, right, and Native American modes of living and all this, and embrace quote unquote white civilization. Now, what's sort of interesting is that scholars now look at this period, and it's sort of an odd thing because a lot of the folks that are going to be pushing for assimilation are a lot of folks that are religious leaders, pacifists, people that are calling for a kinder, gentler way of dealing with the natives. But what a lot of scholars see is that in asking them to give up everything that literally makes them them, you're basically seeing a cultural genocide being perpetuated. And for a lot of Native Americans, the idea that they live without their cultural identity, their belief is they might as well be dead, right? That maybe this is more painful because you have to endure it and see it every day. Now, as you see, I've got some pictures down there at the bottom of Native Americans that had assimilated. There are even some limitations to this sort of softer, gentler, supposedly gentler version of dealing with natives. Because you run into the inherent problem that, okay, well, for the ones that decide to assimilate, number one, how much do they have to assimilate? And for natives during this period, it was they had to assimilate, they had to give up everything. And then number two, what do you do with people, and I'm talking about whites here, that no matter how much these natives change who they are to try to fit in, never accept them as equals, regardless of how much they give up? You are going to see that, right? Because there's two things that these Native Americans can change. They can change the color of their skin, which for a lot of people is going to be a deal breaker in terms of seeing them as equals. The second thing they give up is they can't change the hearts of people that are going to declare them to be inferior no matter what they do. That is not something within their power. So assimilation, even though it sounds like the easy sort of way of dealing with this, it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, right, you have this cultural genocide element, yet on the other hand, even for natives that go this distance, very few of them are going to be accepted. So they're still sort of stuck. And then the last of these ideologies is going to be concentration. Now, if in your mind you're thinking of Native American reservations of the type that are still around today, this is what you're thinking about, right? One big reservation was creating a barrier like the Mississippi River and saying, all right, you guys over there west of the Mississippi River, you do your own thing. right? Concentration is taking a bunch of different native groups and concentrating them into one area and exerting control over them. So they don't necessarily get to keep their tribal customs and traditions, right? You become responsible for providing them what they need to survive. So in a way, you get to drive what they become themselves, right? Now, most of us, when we see this term concentration, something might pop into your head historically, and that might be World War II concentration camps. Now, we're going to talk about earlier event than that where we see concentration utilized. But believe it or not, we're going to find that Adolf Hitler's idea for concentrating Jews and other, quote, undesirables came from what he read and learned and liked about the history of the United States and how they dealt with Native Americans. Now, granted, the main goal of concentrating people as it was not necessarily to kill them, right? As concentration camps, even in World War II, death camps and concentration camps are sort of, in some ways, two different things depending on the period of time that you're looking. But when you look at the history of concentration as an idea, what you find is that when you take large groups of people and concentrate them into one area, illness breaks out, it's hard to take care of them, and numbers of people end up dying, right? So what we're going to see is that the idea of concentrating Native Americans, shoving them in this group, and primarily why are they wanting to do this? Well, if you concentrate them into one area and say that you have to stay there, then you can keep an eye on them, you can control them, you can prevent them from rising up, right? Now, at the end of the day, we're going to see that our federal government, depending on time and administration, goes back and forth. But at the end of the day, what they're going to side with during the period under our discussion is going to be a mixture of two policies. You're going to see the federal government sort of go with assimilation at certain points and concentration at others. But mixed into that, and individual attitudes toward Native Americans and individual events are going to be numerous examples of extermination. So we're all over the map when it comes to dealing with Native Americans, right? And as you can see at the bottom right, their land holdings from 1850, that's sort of what one big reservation would have looked like, to 1865, to 1880, to 1990. All of this you see ultimately. What is it that was desired? What is it that was claimed? Land and territory. Right? Land and territory. It wasn't about making the lives of these people better. It was about gaining control and access to the things that they had that we wanted. So I want to look at a couple of events to give you examples of uh, exterminationist mindsets, right? So again, we talked about the fact that you're not going to see clear-cut, word-for-word federal government policy come out and say that it's their policy to kill all the Native Americans. However, you are going to see leaders engage in exterminationist policies and individuals that have exterminationist mindsets. So let's talk about first the Sand Creek Massacre. This is going to take place in eastern Colorado, near the Kansas border. And it's going to involve the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, who is going a section of them, a small group of them, led by a Native American named Black Kettle. Now, Black Kettle and his people had settled down for the winter, right? This was their winter camp. And in fact, where they had settled was agreed upon by the Colorado territorial government. The territorial governor of Colorado had worked with Black Kettle because there had been some Native American raids in the region, and Black Kettle wanted the governor to understand that his people were not responsible for them. And so Black Kettle was told to make camp near the area by Sand Creek and that they would be safe there. That white leaders, could tell the difference between quote unquote threatening natives, right, and peaceful natives. Now, the problem was that neither the governor nor the military that were in the area, the leadership of them, really were 100% committed to this idea. One of the guys that is going to be fully uncommitted to keeping peaceful Native Americans safe is colonel of a volunteer regiment there in Colorado, because remember, this is happening during the Civil War, so you only have a volunteer regiment, and his name is John Shivington. Now, Shivington was nicknamed the Fighting Parson. He was a pastor by trade, but in reality, he was an avowed Indian hater. He was a firm believer that Native Americans, as you can see in the quote, damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Now that last part, nits make lice, is a cliche that in terms of, if we call somebody nitpicky, right? We're talking about nits, which are the larval stages of lice. So, number one, he's making comparisons to Native Americans as parasites. And number two, the nits are implicating even children, that there is no innocence for Native Americans, because eventually even small natives turn into these parasitic people. Now, what happens is at dawn on November 29th, 1864, about 675 U.S. volunteer soldiers attacked this Sand Creek village of about 750 Cheyenne and Arapaho along the Sand Creek. This happened right at dawn and caught the natives off guard. The troops drove the people out of their camp, and while many managed to escape the initial onslaught, others, particularly non-combatant women, children, and the elderly, fled into and up the bottom of a dry stream bed. The soldiers followed, shooting at them as they struggled through the sandy earth. At a point several hundred yards above the village, the women and children frantically excavated pits and trenches alongside of the stream bed to try to protect themselves. Some adult men attempted to hold back the army with whatever weapons they could find, and in several places at Sand Creek, soldiers shot people from opposite banks. Over the course of 8 hours, troops killed approximately 260 Cheyenne and Arapaho, composed mainly of men, women, and children. Right. During the afternoon and following day, the soldiers wandered over the fields, committing atrocities on the dead, cutting off body parts, some private parts, and taking them as gifts. you get a sense that this was not a battle. Yet, for a good chunk of American history, this was called the Battle of Sand Creek. Historians have gone back and revised this with a title that is definitely more fitting. This was an out and out massacre. And for John Shivington, it was not about attacking, getting revenge on quote unquote bad Indians. Because one of the things I failed to mention was outside of Black Kettle's teepee, who actually he escapes. His wife is shot, but she ends up escaping. But prior to the attack outside of his teepee, he wanted U.S. soldiers to know that he was part of a peaceful group. And so he flew two flags. One was the United States flag, the other was the white flag of peace. Despite those being clearly seen by soldiers in Shivington's band, they're going to continue to hunt down these peaceful natives and kill them, sometimes in graphic detail. A captain named Silas Soule and a lieutenant named Joseph Kramer, they wrote letters of firsthand accounts, and what you find within these firsthand accounts is troubling. Captain Soule wrote a letter December 19th, 1864 to his commanding officer. It reads in part that what he witnessed at Sand Creek was, quote, hundreds of women and children were coming towards us and getting on their knees and begging for mercy. Anthony, another military leader, shouted, kill, quote, kill the sons of bitches. The letter goes on to say in part, quote, the massacre lasted 6 to 8 hours. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and child taken out of her. So a pregnant woman, he said, had her child cut out of her and scalped. So we get a sense of really what's going on here. Crazily enough, despite all the death, Black Kettle once again tries to play by the rules. And so 4 years later, he's going to be a part of another massacre that this one is going to cost him his life. And this is known as the Washita Massacre. And again, a fairly similar situation played out in which you have Native American raids in the region. Black Kettle trying to very clearly state that his people are not involved. This time you have a different military leader, a lieutenant colonel named George Armstrong Custer. Now, of course, Custer is going to go down in infamy later on for the Battle of Little Bighorn. But this is some years before this. And despite earlier being convicted of desertion and mistreatment of soldiers earlier that year, 10 months into his punishment, General Philip Sheridan reinstated Custer, largely because of Custer's wife's family and political connections. He wanted Custer to lead a campaign against Cheyenne, Native American Southern Cheyenne, who had been making raids into Kansas and Oklahoma that summer. Sheridan was frustrated by the fact that his men could not find and engage the enemy with any good ability. And so he's going to tap Custer and the men of the 7th Cavalry. One of the techniques that the U.S. Army is going to use is to sort of get Native Americans, is to wait until winter to really start their offensives. Because for Plains natives, especially those that largely were nomadic, the only time that they would stay in one place for a while would be during the winter camp season. So on November 26, Custer located a village of Cheyenne near the Ouachita, just outside what is today present-day Cheyenne, Oklahoma. Now, Custer, for his part, didn't attempt to identify which group of Cheyenne was in that village, and in fact, his men really didn't make more than a cursory glance at the area and the situation. Had he done so, he again would have seen that these people were right exactly where they were supposed to be. That again, they were flying the white flag of peace, trying to actively avoid conflict. Now, Custer surrounds the village that night, and at dawn called for his band to play a song called Gary Owen, and that was the cue which signaled 4 columns of soldiers to charge into this sleeping village. Scores of Cheyenne were killed in the first 15 minutes. Some natives managed to escape, but within hours the whole village was destroyed, and out of approximately 300 or so natives that had been there, about 103 Cheyenne were killed, including Black Kettle, and a good chunk of them women and children. And again, you get the sense that this, for many, many decades, was called the Battle of the Ouachita. It wasn't a battle. It was an out-and-out massacre. And this was hailed as one of the first substantial American victories, right? So instead of Custer getting any sort of blame for attacking the wrong native group, for killing a peaceful tribe, he is going to be hailed, right, as a great military leader that finally got to the natives. So this in part is going to restore Custer's reputation, and basically we're going to see that for the natives, it puts them in a tough spot, because really what you have are 2 options. You can either decide that you are going to go on reservation lands and no longer resist, or this might embolden you to distrust the federal government and its promises of peace even further, right? And I think really either are reasonable outcomes given the situation. Now, this is not to say that every encounter between the U.S. Army and natives played out like this. This is not to say that Native Americans weren't responsible for massacres on their own, right? It's a complex story, and you sort of have to look at it, and so generalizations often are problematic, but I want to give you an insight through specific examples of exterminationist mindsets, right, where you blur the lines of what is acceptable. I mean, I don't think in many other situations you would see people cheer on the deaths of women and children if they didn't think that all these people were bad and who care, right? Who should care about them. So this is troubling, to say the least, and it's indicting at a very reasonable level. So again, you have the military engaging in problematic behavior. And for the Native Americans, it's going to cost them, many of them, their lives, many of them, their families, many of them, right, their way of life. All right, so here we want to talk about a couple of different concepts. First, I want to look at an event called the Red River War. Right, the Red River War was basically a series of military engagements between the U.S. Army and Native American warriors uh, that were part of the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. And this is going to last from the summer of 1874 all the way into the spring of 1875. Now, what is going to tip this off? If you remember, we had a treaty in place called the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, and that was put in place in 1867. And if you remember, I said as part of those treaties, rations were to be given to Native Americans to feed them. Well, here along reservations, which you see there in modern day Oklahoma, there on the map, rations consistently fell short or fell entirely. Gun running and liquor trafficking by white profiteers were not curtailed, which there were supposed to be very strict laws in place about who could trade with Native Americans and what could be traded, which guns and alcohol were not supposed to be. And you had white outlaws from both Kansas and Texas who entered the territory to steal livestock. Oftentimes, these people, even if caught, were not punished, and in a lot of cases, not even pursued. So, for the natives, right, you have to ask, what are they supposed to do? Now, despite the fact that you had Indian agents, you had some religious leaders that are going to try to remedy the situation. Basically, the government of Washington and the Bureau of Indian Affairs are going to turn a blind eye to them. What ends up happening is you're going to see, with no real other alternative, the tribes were in a really desperate situation. And a Comanche religious leader named Isatai, Isatai, called for what was known as the Sundance. Now, this ceremony had never been part of the Comanche religion prior to this. But one of the things that's going to drive this is the idea of a vision in which they see the person who had the vision saw this Isatai dying whites. And so he took that to mean that if they went to battle against the U.S. military, against the whites, that they would be victorious. Now, one young war leader who this spoke to greatly was the leader of the Cohati Comanches, a guy named Quanah Parker. The Quanah Parker has an interesting background because there to his left is his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, who was a white woman. When she was a little girl, she was taken in a Comanche raid, her and several of her family members. And while some of those family members are negotiated for exchange of prisoners, Cynthia Ann Parker ends up remaining with the Comanche. And to the point that she forgets her own language. She forgets about her Parker family and becomes fully assimilated into Comanche culture. She's going to end up marrying a tribal leader named Peta Nocona, and they are going to have two children, Quanah Parker that you see there, and then a daughter, which the daughter is the one you see Cynthia Ann Parker holding. Believe it or not, her family never gave up trying to find her. And in fact, this picture was taken in Fort Worth after a raid by the Rangers into a Comanche area. They found Cynthia Ann Parker, and they were returning her to her family up in the Panhandle, or out further out. Excuse me, not in the Panhandle, further out east. Now, Quanah Parker was young, and we're going to see that uh, they headed west into the Panhandle of Texas. His strategy is not just going after, not necessarily going after the U.S. military, but he feels that one group that is detrimental to the Comanche way of life are bison hunters, professional bison hunters. Uh, One of the things that ends up occurring, as you can see in the pictures down below, is you get essentially what is the corporate hunting of bison, and largely for their furs. You can see stacks of them there on the picture on the right. This is really offensive to Native Americans, largely because of the scale, right? They're killing these bison. In some instances, murdering hundreds in one day, tens of thousands in a summer, right? In fact, uh, I want to say the largest single one day total was something like 600 in one day that are killed. The deal about bison is that they're prey animals, even though they're huge, they are prey animals. Uh, Prey animals have herd instincts. Bison can't see very well until you get up close. They don't have good distance vision. They rely on a sense of smell, but that only helps if what you're needing to warn you of danger is blowing right in your face. So what happens is you get guys with repeating rifles. You get guys with on the back of railroad cars with Hotchkiss guns, big repeating machine guns, and they fire into crowds of bison. And of course, this takes down several of them. The herd sort of runs, and after the fire stops, the herd's calm and they come back to where those other bison have fallen because they don't understand that those other bison or buffalo are dead. And so then the hunters open up on them again, and they just sort of keep doing this, right? So the pile, the mountain you see that guy standing on is all buffalo skulls from top to bottom. And for the Comanche, an even bigger reason that this is something that is going to propel them to war is the fact that this is a sacred animal, right? And largely beyond the skins and the tongues and all that, a lot of the parts of the animal that for the Comanche and other plain natives, they would use all parts of these animals to survive. A lot of those animals are just left to rot in the sun, which to the Comanche that respect and revere the things that they hunt, it's not good. So Quanah Parker decides to take it to these buffalo hunters. Now, if you look at the map that shows the battles in the top left, you'll see in the right panhandle shot, June 27th, you have adobe walls right at the top. Now, here at Adobe Walls, it's a buffalo hunting outpost. And so this is going to occur between June 27th and July 1st, 1874, when a party of warriors attacked a buffalo hunter's camp. In the first initial skirmish, 3 whites were killed, but as many as 70 natives were killed and wounded. largely because for the Comanche, they wanted to fight up close, and they realized in this that they're fighting people that essentially are sharpshooters, right? Uh, Now, what happens is that after this, we're going to see that the military is going to end up engaging. And so the rest of the war really is going to be a series of hit and run battles, right? Now, if you look at the bottom, you get the Palo Duro Canyon, September 24th. Now, what's going to happen here is that the U.S. military, either accidentally or through some intelligence that they get from Native Americans, find that they're in the Palo Duro Canyon, which is sort of like a miniature version in some ways of the Grand Canyon. It's all this flat plateau, and then all of a sudden you see there's this drop of several hundred feet down into this gorge carved out by long ago gone rivers. What the U.S. military didn't know prior to this was that one of the ways that the Comanche are able to do this is because of the number of horses. The Comanche were great horsemen. They could fight on horseback. But for these warriors, about 700 of them, they had thousands of horses and were able to flee when the U.S. military would get on them. And they had spare horses, so once their horses got tired of running, they would tie up spares along their path out so that they could escape while the horses that the U.S. Army had couldn't go any further. So what happens is that the U.S. military finally figures out where their hideout is. They're in the Palo Duro Canyon, where the horses are at, where they sort of disappear to at certain points. And so the U.S. military is going to ride down into the Palo Duro Canyon. Most of the natives are able to escape, but they're not able to get everything out of the canyon, including the horses. And so several thousand horses are going to be killed at the bottom of the Palo Duro Canyon. Now, the other thing that is really going to take its toll is that corporate buffalo hunting that we were talking about. Now, the U.S. military, contrary to popular belief, it's not the U.S. military that's going out largely and killing these buffalo. But the U.S. military is going to engage in behaviors that promote the killing of the buffalo. So General Philip Sheridan, in trying to use ideas about total warfare, believes that the only way that you can starve the natives into surrender is by killing their food source. So what the U.S. Army does is that it amps up the number of hunters that are allowed to hunt in the area. Despite rules about when hunting was supposed to take place and where it could take place, the U.S. Army would, in fact, give information to bison hunters of where herds were, even in illegal places, and basically turn the other direction and say, hey, even though these bison are on reservation land, we saw them out there. Just saying, right? And the bison herds are almost going to be driven to extinction. In fact, by the time we get to around 1900, 1902, somewhere in that vicinity, there's going to be less than 100 buffalo left from what had been all the way back in the 1500s, estimated to be over 40 million, now dwindled down to less than 100. And if it wasn't for conservation efforts undertaken starting in that period, there would be no buffalo today. Right? So we're going to see now with the Native Americans two greatest things that they needed in order to continue this fight: a food source while they're on the run, they're off the reservation, and fast horses to be able to escape the military. We're going to see that without those things, they can no longer push their resistance. And Quanah Parker, faced with his people on the brink of starvation, makes a very hard decision that he is going to ride on to the reservation. Right? There never is any formal surrender. He just rides on and the war stops. This is going to represent the last of any real large scale resistance to concentration in the South. But I want to underscore here, right, this policy of trying to kill off the buffalo herds. You really see the exterminationist element behind this, right? That we're going to kill off their food source to resistance. We're not really taking care of them, even on the reservations where we tell them we're going to. So there's really no value in many ways for life, and you're taking away the ability of people to survive. So this goes down as yet another example of exterminationist mindset, right? And it's not, unfortunately, going to be the last. All right, so here we're going to look at different set of policies, assimilationist policies. And again, this was often portrayed as the gentler, kinder approach to dealing with Native Americans, especially when you had large massacres reported or large numbers, like with the Battle of Little Bighorn, even the killing large numbers of U.S. troops die in these Indian wars. People would say, well, there's got to be some better way. And typically, these people were religious leaders back east, a lot of them pacifists, Quakers, uh, even some that were calling for a more peace, just generally peaceful approach in politics. So one of the things that we're going to find is that in some ways this wasn't kinder and gentler. And this presented benevolence in many ways has a much darker aspect to it than meets the eye. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Carlisle Indian School. Now, throughout the country, there are going to be a number of Native American schools, but probably the largest and the most famous is the Carlisle Indian School that is created in 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The picture on the bottom with all the kids in it shows Carlisle and all of its quote-unquote students. The guy who is going to create and run the school is a Quaker and former U.S. Military officer that had taken part in the Indian Wars, a guy named Richard Henry Pratt. He says a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That is typically attributed to Philip Sheridan. Great General has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and in a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian and save the man, right? His idea was that Native culture, Native mentality, Native identity was the root of the problem, and that if you can just force these people to adopt a Western white way of life, then it will be their saving grace. Now, as Richard Henry Pratt set this school up, it was not a sort of nice, gentle sort of school, and not everybody there was there because they wanted to be. A lot of these Native American children were taken from their families. A lot of them were forced to go here. For a lot of Native American families, seeing the amount of death as a result of either starvation or the Indian Wars or a combination of the two, or even adding disease into the mix, the thought was this was the only way for our children to physically make it. The other part is this is not going to be a gentle school. This is going to be run like a military academy. So corporal punishment, a lot of it was handed out. There were all kinds of substantiated allegations of not just physical abuse but sexual abuse that occurred to a number of the kids that were here. So in any sense, it was not a good place to be. Uh, you see in the pictures on the right, sort of before and after shots, the top two pictures. You have a native named Hasten Toalai, and this is taken less than a year after his arrival. The second picture is taken less than a year after his arrival. This is the first picture is how he arrived. Second picture, right, he was Tom Torlino. He had changed his name, something that they required. There below that, you see a group of Native Americans that arrive, and 4 months later, the before and after, right? So they're going to be required to change their name. They're going to be required to learn English. They're going to be stripped of Native American tribal customs and so on. The sad part is that for many of these natives, there's several sad parts. One is that for many of them who arrive here, they had not had to engage in areas with folks from the East. And so outbreaks of disease, many of which these natives that come from the West are not immune to, are going to kill them off. So you can imagine the tragedy that parents face when they receive a letter saying that the kid that they either had taken from them or that they, as a last resort, put in this school ends up dying of illness. It's just heartbreaking. Then the other situation is, well, okay, they go to this school. What's the end game? What sort of happens? Well, after this, they're supposed to be able to go out and get jobs and assimilate into society. Well, what you end up finding is that a lot of the jobs that are set up for them are sort of servile labor, right? As servants in the homes of whites. Not very much a liberating way to live. Now, some like Tom Torlino are going to have the last laugh in some respects. Tom Torlino, after he's done at Carlisle Indian School, gets back to his reservation, gets back to his lands, and he starts using the education that he was given him to defend his people. Right, he's going to speak for them in legal disputes over their land, in legal disputes with the federal government, and in some ways it is going to provide him with the ammunition to stand up to white oppression by the federal government, because they had given him the tools to attack them using their own systems against them. The hardest part for this, right, is you're going to see the cultural genocide of a lot of Native American language, a lot of Native American cultural attributes that are going to be attempted to be killed off here. You're also going to see that for many of these natives, they can do all this. Even if they did all this, for a lot of folks, it's still not going to change. White folks, it's not going to change their mentality about natives. They're still going to see them as savages, maybe dressed up savages, to use a lot of their language at the time. But it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, a lot of people cannot get past skin color, and a lot of people cannot get past, right, sort of their identity as natives, and see them, no matter how much they adapt or adopt or assimilate, that they're still not equal, right? Probably one of the greatest known graduates of the Carlisle Indian School is a Native American whose Christian name, he comes from the Sac and Fox tribe. His Christian name is Jim Thorpe. His Native American name translated roughly into Bright Path. And Jim Thorpe was an amazing athlete. Uh, when I was growing up, one of the things I remember is what we call sort of two-sport athletes, people like Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders that were able to play two professional sports at one time. And we marveled in that just because of the physicality that it took and the toll that it took, right? Well, Jim Thorpe was a three-sport player. He played professional football for the Canton Bulldogs. He played professional basketball, and he played semi-professional baseball. He is an Olympic, or was an Olympic gold medal winner. He won 2 gold medals in a triathlon, in a pentathlon and a decathlon, a 5 track event, 5 track and field event race, and a 10. The crazy part is he didn't just win, he killed it. I mean, he went out there and just utterly destroyed the competition. It wasn't close in a lot of these races. Jim Thorpe probably is one of the greatest just naturally gifted athletes the world has ever seen. And one of the races that he runs, I believe, I can't remember if it's the 400 or the 800, but in one of the races that he runs, the night before he goes out, someone breaks into where he's at, and they steal his shoes. And so the next morning he wakes up, he doesn't have any shoes. And so they go and they have to dig through the trash to find shoes. They don't find a matching pair. One of the shoes got a hole in the bottom of it. They put newspaper in there. He wears those shoes, which are 2 different sizes, and he wins the race and sets a record while doing it, right? Which should give you some sort of sense of his ability. Now, despite all this, despite going and winning 2 medals for a country that doesn't even consider him to be necessarily a citizen, and many of his people, not a citizen, we're going to see that Jim Thorpe has those medals taken from him. In the months following the Olympic Games, reports come out that Jim Thorpe had violated the amateur athlete rule of Olympics. The idea that if you played professional sports of any kind, it disqualified you from competing. It ruined your amateur athletic status. You got paid. Now they claim, right, his playing for a semi-professional baseball team or a minor league baseball team, that's what did it. Well, here's the reality. He admits that, yes, he did it. He also admits that he didn't know that that was a rule, that nobody had ever explained that to him, and he had no idea, and he was sorry about it. But also what he failed, because he wasn't one to whine and complain, even when things didn't go his way, what he failed to mention was that tons of other white athletes did exactly the same thing and then competed in the Olympics. The difference was they knew it was against the law or against the rules. And so what they did was they used a fake name to play for the semi-pro team so that it wasn't connected to them later on when they would play for the Olympics, when they would compete in the Olympics. A lot of people did this. Jim Thorpe happened to be one that got caught for it. Now, you can say, well, the rule's a rule. Well, if we're going to go a rule's a rule, here's also part of the problem. Within the rules of the Olympic Committee, right? We're going to see that they have certain time frames for which investigations can be done. And the issue here is the time frame from when the Olympics, I think it's 6 months, that 6 months from the end of the Olympics, you have that time frame to challenge any of the results or have issue. Well, this challenge, this earth-shattering news of him competing and violating the amateur athlete clause, didn't come out until well after 6 months. So, even by their own rules, this investigation shouldn't have happened. But it goes on and they strip him of these medals. And it's not until the 1980s, when Jim Thorpe is dead, that finally the International Olympic Committee decides that they made a mistake and they reinstate Jim Thorpe. They reinstate those gold medal wins to him. The problem with that, I mean, that's a good thing. They should have done that. But the one thing that they didn't do is the people that he beat in those Olympic Games who might have set records, they didn't put the records that he set in there. They kept those. The person who came in second, if they came in second, they still can break a record. And so they still are the record holders officially, even though he beat them. So I say all this to say that oftentimes we think that sports or popular culture can elevate people who are considered minorities above the color line and make it to where a lot of the consequences don't apply. But one of the things that you see is that even amongst Jim Thorpe, who was a big-time professional athlete, he still had to face a large amount of discrimination and racism, right? And if he's as popular as he was, and he has to face this, how do you think regular people, what do you think they had to face? Right? What do you think people who weren't big-time athletes? So it sort of puts it in perspective. Now, there are going to be people that advocate for Native American rights, whether it be individuals or organizations. Helen Hunt Jackson is one of those. She writes a book in 1881 called A Century of Dishonor, in which she basically is going to make the case that the U.S. government has, throughout its time in dealing with Native Americans, continually lied to them, continually egged on a lot of the violence that has gone on. She's not going to say that Native Americans hadn't been violent, but, she says if you're looking at the reality of the situation, most of the times it's in reaction to the violence of the U.S. government, right? And she's going to argue that the only way for this to move forward is for the U.S. government to start being honest, start being respectful in the way in which it deals with Native Americans, start to treat them as equals. But also within it, again, is a little bit of this sort of bad element sprinkled in, because basically for her, for Native Americans to do well, that they've got to embrace Christianity and they've got to assimilate. It's still this notion that they aren't okay just being who they are, right? So despite her being an advocate for Native American rights and Native American liberties, and good on her for that, she's still lagging around a mentality that says that for sort of true peace between the two groups, it's got to be natives that change. The U.S. government has to change, but also natives have to change. And the reality is that, no, it's just the U.S. government's got to stop doing stuff and just leave these folks be. Now, another assimilationist policy, last one we're going to talk about here, it's called the Dawes Severalty Act. Uh, this is going to be passed in Congress in 1887. Okay, and it's named after a senator from Massachusetts named Henry Dawes. So here's the idea, right, behind the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act is that we want to make Native Americans citizens. We want to make them farmers, right? We want to promote individual property rights and so on. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to count every right we're going to look at census data, and we're going to count every Native American that's in a tribe. And what we're going to do is we're then going to take those numbers and we're going to look at how much acreage that they have. And instead of Native Americans holding tribal lands together, right, as sort of communal, that I can leave and come back and it's still my home, we're going to divide it up individually into what are called allotments, right? So basically, we're introducing Native Americans to the idea of private property. Now, again, this can be seen as, okay, we're assimilating them to how modern people deal with it, or you could see this, if you were so inclined, as a way of dividing up tribal lands amongst individuals to sow derision and make it harder for them to maintain. It's almost like if you look at sort of great historic cattle ranches even here in Texas. You had lands that were held by a single family, and then when they died, they passed that on to the kids, and they divided up amongst the kids, and then there are further divisions. Well, then it's hard to keep all that land together, and eventually people start selling off their plots and so on. So makes it harder to hold that land over time. So this allotment was of 160 acres, right, to each individual that were in there, which sounds a lot like, if you remember, sort of the Homestead Act, right? But here's sort of the key difference. If you remember the Homestead Act, how many years did a person have to hold it? They had to hold it for 5 years, right? Pay their $10, make some improvements, and then after 5 years it would be theirs. With the Dawes Severalty Act, Native Americans would have to hold the land for 25 years. 25 years before it could be theirs. Right? The idea is that they have to prove that they're good stewards. The other part to this, there's a couple other dimensions, is that a lot of the land, right, that they're giving away, they're doing so in hopes of making these people farmers. A lot of the land that they end up giving away is unfarmable, either because of lack of water, lack of irrigation, bad soil, right? So in a way, you're setting people up for failure. You also, if they're given to everybody, well, small children can't farm hundreds of acres. Neither can old people, super old people. So what are they supposed to do with their land? Well, you might say, well, if they don't like it, right, they can sell it. Whoops, no, you can't. Remember, it's not yours for 25 years. So if you can't sell it, and you can't make it work, then what do you do with it? For a lot of these Native Americans, if they can't make it work, they're just going to walk away from it. And weirdly enough, this land is then going to be open and sold to whites. Right? So the crazy part about this is that unlike maybe what good-hearted people had in mind that this was some good notion, the interesting part of what allotment ends up doing is it ends up actually stripping more land away from Native Americans than before. It's estimated between 1887 and 1934, when these things were in place, this Dawes Act was in effect, Native Americans lost control of, quote, about 100 million acres of land. So roughly about 92 million acres, which represented 2/3 of the land base that they held in 1887. So 2/3 of the land that they held before this law started get stripped from them in a law that is supposed to be there to quote unquote help them. Okay? So this is going to attempt to break up tribalism. And the crazy part is, remember I said that it goes from 1887 to 1934? Well, think about what's going on in 1934 in American history. What's going on is the Great Depression. And so you've got a situation in which a lot of Americans are suffering. And so during the Great Depression, FDR passes a new law, the Indian Reorganization Act, which stopped the allotment, which was good. But what it basically told Native Americans was, we're not going to take care of you, even though that's what we said we were going to do, and you didn't ask for it all the way back when. You go back during this crisis in which our federal government is trying to help everybody else. Y'all go back to being tribal societies and y'all take care of each other, right? So notice that, that's just neck breaking how that comes out. That for decades we try to drill into Native Americans the idea of being individual citizens and the idea that they are wards of the government. And I said individual citizens, I meant individual people. And now, when it's not convenient for us meaning the U.S. government, we tell them, forget all that decades worth of stuff that we forced you into and go back to how things were. How frustrating would that be? So even these supposedly nice, gentle assimilation policies that were set out by advocates, peace advocates, turn out to be destructive in the end. Some intentional, some unintentional, and some somewhere in the mix. Here we get to our last clip, our last slide, looking at the West. And basically what we're going to see is an end to the quote-unquote Indian Wars and settlers finally sort of finishing their move out west. Now, it wouldn't be complete to talk about the end of this period without talking about one event. And that event is the Wounded Knee Massacre. Again, historically, for decades known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. It is not a battle. Now, to give some background for this, right? Throughout 1890, the U.S. government started getting increasingly worried about the promulgation and the practice of a dance that had not originated amongst the Lakota Sioux, but had arrived there, called the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance originated out west among the Paiute tribe, and its practitioner, its leader, was a Native American whose native name was Wovoka. You see him pictured there in the big hat. But Wovoka had converted to Christianity and changed his name to Jack Wilson. Very close in translation, right? So Wilson had put together this ceremonial dance because he had come to believe, as sort of this religious leader and Christian, claiming Christian religious leader, that white Americans had subverted the will of God in the way in which they had mistreated their Native American brethren. And that God was so angry at whites for this mistreatment that God was going to punish whites for their behavior. Now, Jack Wilson throughout this renounced the use of violence himself, told the practitioners of the ghost dance that they would have to renounce violence, that this punishment was going to be not meted out by them but by God. So Wovoka created this dance and said that if enough natives practiced it and God was pleased, that he would bring about uh, sort of what was promised, he claimed. What he claimed God promised. The first thing that Jack Wilson claimed about the ghost dance was that if this was done, the white population of North America, of the land, would be removed from the continent. Right? Doesn't say exactly necessarily how this was going to be done. Again, God would intervene and it would happen. But Native Americans would be safe, they would remain, whites would be forced out. Secondly, if they practice this ghost dance, the second promise that he said would be done was that all the buffalo herds that had been killed off in the millions would return to the plains, right? So parts of their culture, parts of their food. Third, he says that old leaders, old warriors that had been killed in battle, would be brought back to life. Right? Now, he claims that for this to work, natives have to convert to a mono-religious sort of setup. They have to believe in one God. They got to believe in Jesus. Right? And they have to renounce violence. Now, what's going to happen is that Native Americans are so desperate, many of them on the verge of starvation, seeing their way of life eroding before their very eyes, that many are willing to try anything. And so Native American representatives make their way to where Wovoka is located in Nevada, learn the ghost dance, learn how to practice it, and then they're going to bring it back. Now, what ends up happening when you transmit ceremonial or religious type things is that often when it goes places, it doesn't look exactly like it was originally laid out. So, for example, once it gets back to the Dakotas, the Lakota Sioux are going to add one more thing to that ghost dance, which was if the ghost dance is performed, then the white man's bullets cannot hurt them. Right? Now, we're going to see that when they take this back and present it to tribal leaders, some of them are hesitant, some of them are outright dismissive. In fact, Sitting Bull, who was a Native American religious figure, an older man by this point, was very much opposed to the idea. He thought that not only was it not accurate, but that it would cause problems. But what ends up going down is that where Sitting Bull was located, right? There at a place called the Pine Ridge Agency. You've got the Pine Ridge Agency, which is in southern North Dakota, and then you've got Standing Rock Agency, which is in northern South Dakota. So what ends up happening is that Sitting Bull, enough pressure is put on him to where he finally says, "Fine, right? If you guys uh, want me to support what you're doing, I don't really believe in it, but go for it, whatever." Now, Sitting Bull was preparing to go from Pine Ridge to Standing Rock, and the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, were so afraid because of what they had seen with the Red River War. If you remember, that started with the Sun Dance. They thought that these dances were called a rebellion, which, if the federal government knew anything about this dance, they would see that it's not. So they had banned the dance, but also they want to make sure that Sitting Bull, who they assumed was a ghost dancer, would not go to Standing Rock. So what happens December 15th, 1890, Native American police try to arrest him. And in the process, end up killing him. Right? So a lot of Native Americans flee the reservation because of the murder of Sitting Bull, that if they're going to end up killing him, and he's one of the most well-known and well-respected leaders, who are they not going to try to kill? So what happens is the U.S. military is called out to put Native Americans back on reservation areas, and that's going to lead us to Wounded Knee. So on December 29th, the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry surrounded a band of Lakota Sioux under the leadership of a Native American named Bigfoot. They demanded that Bigfoot and his men surrender their weapons, and Bigfoot and his men did not have many weapons. Their group was on the verge of starvation, and Bigfoot himself was suffering from really bad pneumonia to the point that he couldn't even stand on his own. Now, what ends up happening is that as this surrender was going on, a fight breaks out between a Native American and a U.S. soldier. The story is that the Native American, I've seen in some stories as named Yellowbird, and others Black Coyote. Either way, the claim is that this Native American was deaf, and so he had not heard the call for weapons. And so when a U.S. military man comes up and grabs the weapon, tries to grab the weapon from him, there's a struggle and a shot goes off. The insane part is that surrounding the camp of a few hundred Native Americans are massive howitzers, repeating guns. And so when that shot goes off, we're going to see that a brutal massacre follows. It's estimated that anywhere from between 150 to as high as 300 possibly Native Americans are killed. Almost half of those women and children. For their part, the U.S. Army lost 25 men. But again, the thing was, this was originally called a battle, even though most of the people there, Native American people that were there, were unarmed, right? And they were surrounded by massive guns. Some historians argue that this was the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry taking revenge for what had happened at Little Bighorn. Regardless, we're going to see that not only did this massacre end in the deaths of hundreds, but also it's going to end the ghost dance movement, and it's going to end any sort of large-scale Native American resistance, right? So we end up seeing that in the aftermath of this, right, if we want to talk about what opened up the West, it wasn't that it was this open place. It's that it is going to be made open through the concentration into reservations and the killing off of large number of Native Americans. That's what's going to open a lot of lands to westward settlement, specifically the Great Plains. Now, after this, you're going to see a lot of farmers and ranchers start making their way out west, specifically farmers in the upper Great Plains. And as a result, you've got ranchers that are moving cattle herds toward railroads. They're cutting across farmlands. In 1873, Joseph Glidden introduces barbed wire, which is going to be a way for farmers to try to protect their crops, a cheap way, especially in areas where there's not a lot of wood. Can't make fences out of grass. I guess you could try. So barbed wire is cheap, it's efficient, and it's pretty good at keeping cattle out. Today we think of barbed wire as keeping cattle in, but back then it was to keep cattle out. And what happens as they start carving up these chunks of land with barbed wire? And we start to see the closing of the range, starting in the 1870s and ending by the early 1900s. We're going to see that cowhands, as they push through a lot of these places, they're going to start cutting into these fences and letting their cattle just gorge themselves on the farmers' crops. And this is going to start what we call the range wars between farmers and ranchers. Now, despite what you see on TV, ranching cowboys are always sort of portrayed as the violent, rambunctious type. Farmers are always shown as the meek and mild sort. The reality was that more often than not, it's going to be farmers that are going to be pushed to the point of violence. Because for these cowhands, number one, it's typically not their herds. They're working for somebody else. So when it comes down to who's got the most to lose, it's the farmers. Their livelihoods, their futures are dependent upon these crops, their ability to feed their families. So when cattlemen start cutting through their fences, they're going to be willing to defend it all the way to the death. And typically what you find is those cowboys, since it's not their crops, they're not going to be willing to die for that. It's not their cows, not their crops. They're not going to be willing to die for those things. And so often it's going to be the farmer that ends up winning the day, refusing to back down, and the cowboy has to turn tail and run. Now, as more and more people start moving out, we're going to see farmers start banding together in an educational and social movement called the Grange Movement. And this is to try to sort of modernize farming methods and get farmers more politically active to deal with problems. This is going to be the forerunner to what we talked about previously in the Gilded Age called the Populist Party, right? So it starts with this Grange movement. The last big open land boom, again, is not going to be open. It's going to involve what is today the state of Oklahoma. Back then they called it the Indian Territory. Now what happens in Oklahoma is a direct result of, right, what we had talked about before in terms of the Dawes Act, right? The allotment practices of the Dawes Act. So again, what they do here is the federal government looks at the number of people, divides the land up, and the thing is, any leftover land, and this is how the U.S. government's going to get so much. Any leftover land then goes back and becomes the property of the government. Because the argument is, hey, everybody's got 160 acres. You don't need any more than that. So all this is excess. So what starts is in the 1880s, when the Dawes Act is underway, a lot of farmers are going to push for those lands that are not claimed, or those lands that people walk away from, to be opened up to settlers. And by the late 1880s, this is exactly what happens. So we're going to see this Oklahoma land boom, is it's called, or the Oklahoma land rush. And the two groups that take part in this are known as the boomers and the Sooners. And I say two groups, a lot of times these terms are somewhat overlapping. All of these people that engage in this land rush are going to be boomers, right? They're going to be people that are going to be there trying to get as much land as cheaply as possible. But typically, the ones that sort of violate the rules and how they get it, they're called the Sooners. Now, what would happen is plots of land would be made available on certain days. People would line up, as you see in the picture on the bottom next to the map. People would line up at a certain time after they registered, and essentially a gun would be fired and people would race out onto the prairie and start claiming plots of land. If you can imagine, this is going to be like sort of Black Friday sales were a few years ago, and to some extent still are. This mad dash to try to get as much land as quickly as you can. So the Sooners, what they would do is they knew that, it's publicly announced when this land was going to be given away. They would go out and they would try to hide on the land in areas that they wanted, so that when that gunshot went off, they were sort of there first. So they did it sooner than everybody else, the illegal way of doing it, and so they get the name Sooners. So to sort of tie a bow on all of this, right, we see that the West is full of mythology. And if you dig beyond the myths, you can find, real truths that are a lot more entertaining, and not just entertaining, a lot more informative than the stuff that is made up. The other thing that you can find is that the relationship between the U.S. government and Native Americans has been fraught. It has been full of ill intention, hypocrisy, and even in moments of benevolency, still comes with a lot of baggage and problems. And at the end of the day, we're going to see that any telling of the West and Western settlements that don't point out the excruciating pains that Native Americans had to deal with just to survive does not reflect or does not tell the whole story of our history. And in fact, if this is the way it's being told, it's doing it deliberately to try to mask the harsh realities and dodge the responsibility that we have as a nation to sort of confront this history, confront this injustice. There's really no other way around it. So the best that we can do is sort of learn about these situations, have a broader context and broader understanding for what happened, why it happened, and then this sort of sets a path to make sure and demand that something like this never happens again.